The way I like to process things is by re-explaining them to people. So I wrote a blog post. That was like, here's actually what you need to know about OAuth. And I called it OAuth 2 Simplified. And that blog is still the most popular post on my site to this day. Because apparently a lot of people are confused about OAuth and need it simplified, which I completely understand. So that's really where it started. MCP is saying, we're not going to build everything from scratch. We're not going to build the authorization layer from scratch. We're going to take OAuth, but we're going to pick certain parts of it that make sense. And that's where they've chosen things like the protected resource metadata and now client ID metadata. They've described the end-to-end, connect the dots for you. Because you're not going to connect the dots yourself if you just look at all the RFCs. And I was working on a little prototype to try this out myself of like, as an exercise, what would it take to build a tiny authorization server that is just a single file source code, and all it does is, takes in these requests for access tokens signed by an IDP, and then it issues an access token. And it is surprisingly little code. And that alone, like I could deploy that somewhere and then no longer need API keys anywhere. And any user that has an account at the enterprise IDP would have access to this MCP server. And it's such a small amount of code to write. So hopefully I'll get that. I'll post that somewhere, once I clean it up a little bit. But it's a good demo. And I think that's a much better path, especially in the enterprise context compared to API keys.
Welcome to the Scalekit podcast. I'm Ravi, one of the co-founders of Scalekit. Scalekit is an auth stack for AI applications. Today, I'm excited to welcome Aaron Parecki, a prominent figure in the identity authentication and authorization space. You may already have known or heard or read his name a lot. He's a contributing member in a lot of OAuth-related RFCs and specs. Aaron has been instrumental in shaping the entire future of secure and scalable authentication systems. So I'm a huge fan of Aaron, and Aaron, it's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Briefly tell me about how you got introduced to the whole identity world and why or what appeals to you so much about it that you stuck with it for so long.
Yeah, I mean, it actually goes back to when I was building a startup and building a developer platform for people who were building applications. And this was quite a while ago now, back when OAuth 2 was still in the process of being developed. And, there was already a handful of OAuth 1 things out there, and I had a bit of experience, using OAuth 1 APIs like Flickr or whatever. And it was very clear that there were some challenges with it that people were trying to solve by building OAuth 2. The whole space seemed very confusing to me at the time, but it was clear that that was where the industry was heading. And I needed to learn about OAuth. So in order to build a developer platform, I knew OAuth was the thing to use to protect that API and to let users log in and authorize applications. So I just sat down one day and I was like, I need to get up to speed on this. And I read the spec. It was OAuth 2 draft 10. So that was, sometime in 2010, I think. And sat down, read it one night, and I was like, oh, you know what? That wasn't actually as bad as I thought it was going to be. The way I like to process things is by re-explaining them to people. So I wrote a blog post. That was like, here's actually what you need to know about OAuth. And I called it OAuth 2 Simplified. And that blog is still the most popular post on my site to this day, because apparently a lot of people are confused about OAuth and need it simplified, which I completely understand. So that's really where it started. And, I just kind of found myself getting involved in the discussions about OAuth and seeing, following the development of OAuth 2 as it became final towards RFC. And I don't know, I just kind of stumbled into it, I guess. I didn't really think too much about it. It wasn't like a conscious decision to get involved, but because I was working on this platform at the time, it was very much driven by my own needs of like, I'm building this. I have questions, I have challenges, I have things that, I wish would work differently. And it just kind of all went from there.
Yeah, makes sense. And to give credit to the spec itself, it feels like it's even more relevant today than when it was introduced like 12, 13, 14 years back.
It is very interesting to me that's been true, is that the whole premise of OAuth was that we need a way to let users grant access to their data to applications that they don't necessarily trust with their password. So like, it's not a big deal to enter your password and into like your first party app of, you download the Flickr app and it asks for your Flickr password. Cool. That makes sense. Not a big deal. I got that. It is my account. But as soon as you're like using third-party applications, that need to get some data from your account, like read your photos or read your contacts or only do certain operations, then yeah, and especially if they're third party, you don't want to share your password with them. So that was the whole premise of it. And clearly, like, that problem has not gone away, right? Like, we still have this problem in every industry with every new development, including with the whole AI stuff that's going on right now. It's the same problem, right? Again and again.
Yeah, I mean, and also it's not just one document, right? There are a lot of RFCs and it
Tell me
kept
about it.
evolving over it kept evolving over a period of time. And that's what I find most beautiful about it. Even the OAuth 2.1 that was proposed, it's not a new thing. It's like, hey, don't do some of the things that are bad and do some of the things that are good. And you kind of simplified 2.0 to 2.1. So tell me about that transition. Why did you think that was needed?
Yeah. So if you look at OAuth 2, it actually is, it's not that big of a document. Like, it has a lot in it, but actually, like, it sets up a framework, right? And then
Yeah,
it leaves a lot of stuff missing that
yeah,
you have to then figure out how to solve. And for some cases, it's okay to solve it in a custom proprietary way. But as soon as you want things to be interoperable, you need to define that as a new spec. So
yeah,
over the years, more and more of those things started getting defined. And that's things like, could be anything from, well, Pixie was one example of, like, it's solving a security feature. It's a security feature more than anything. But then there's features like, maybe the biggest example of this would be the JOT access token spec, which is actually relatively new and in the scheme of things. But the idea with JOT access tokens is in core OAuth, you actually don't have to specify how a API validates its access tokens. You need to know that an access token represents a user granting an application some limited access, but it doesn't have to be defined if you are building an OAuth server into your API, like, as the same thing, which is actually pretty common. Like, if you look at consumer APIs, it's actually pretty common architecture. Like the GitHub API, you just kind of see it as one thing and it has OAuth built in, right? If you want to spin up an OAuth server that's physically separate from your API, you need some communication between them. And if you're doing this on your own, you can make your own custom thing and no one's going to even know about it, right? But this is where we get into, as this space has matured, you end up with companies like Scalekit or Auth0 or others that are building an OAuth server as a product, and they want to sell that product and make it work with anybody's API they're building. And now all of a sudden, we do need to kind of more formally define what are the access tokens they're going to create and how can someone validate them. And again, this started out as, just proprietary individual implementations of it. And Auth0 had JOT access tokens for a long time, and that was actually that specific work between, Auth0 and a few others who were doing this that led to the standard for JOT access tokens. And now that it's an RFC and it's a standard, there's a common set of claims, which means that you can do things like provide SDKs or middleware that speaks this language and plug it into any provider that supports the RFC, which is much better than saying hard coding your API validation logic to just Auth0 or just Scalekit or whatever, right? So that's the benefit of standards. And that's just one example of the kinds of things that have evolved in OAuth over time. There's a bunch more. If you look at all the maze of specs out there, there's a lot. Not everybody needs all the specs either. That's another thing, is that for some people, like, the base level of features or security is enough, but you might want to add new features or add more security capabilities. And that's where a lot of the newer specs fit in too, is they're optional things if you have the need that is solved by them, which is also a big driver or a big factor in this is the MCP work now, right? Where MCP is, it's an API format at the end of the day, but the way that it gets rolled out does have some unique aspects to it that are challenging a lot of the original assumptions of OAuth.
yeah,
And so we're having to evolve OAuth also to address those needs, right?
yeah. Things like CIMD and DCR, and they're getting more and more prominence because of, the newer or specialistic needs that the MCP would need, right?
Yep. Yeah. Oh, I was going to dive into to some of that if you want to get
Sure,
into the
yeah, that'll be
specifics
helpful.
of,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
So one of the original assumptions with OAuth was that a developer knows what API they are trying to talk to and can read the documentation for that API and can actually go and sign up as a developer at that service. And that's been a assumption in OAuth for a very long time, and it actually does pretty well in terms of, it's just how things work most of the time, right? You go to you want to hit the Google Calendar API, well, you have to go register as a Google developer, go, apply for your your credentials and get your app reviewed and et cetera, et cetera. So because of that, there has never been a need for dynamically registered clients, until someone didn't want to go with that assumption. And MCP is not the first one at all to do this, but it's probably the most popular. And this is the premise with MCP, is that the MCP client developers don't know ahead of time what servers their users are going to connect them to. And as soon as you don't have that knowledge and that relationship as the developer, then it doesn't really make sense to require the developer go make a developer account at the service they're trying to access, because the developer doesn't know, because it's the user that's connecting that application. So that's one of the fundamental challenges that the MCP ecosystem is introducing into this. And again, they're not the first ones to do this, but they're definitely the most popular.
Yeah, MCP also made a client can talk to any resource server possible in a standardized manner. Before MCP, that was not the case. I mean, the client had to implement code to talk to a specific resource server in a specific manner. But because of this nature, the client wouldn't know ahead of time which MCP server it's talking to or which resource server it's talking to. So that kind of complicated things. So going back to the OAuth part, OAuth 2.0 and 2.1 was coming out well. Why was the need for OIDC had to come in? Like, what was the special problem that OIDC is solving?
Good question. So OAuth 2 was specifically addressing the use case of API access, as in, as a user, you're trying to grant access to your data to this application. So if we take a calendar example, I'm trying to let some application read the events on my calendar and maybe schedule events on my calendar. In order for the application to do that, the application does not actually need to know anything about my identity. It actually just needs access to an API. It needs some sort of API credential it can use to access the resources that are mine, right? But nowhere in that flow does it actually need to know my name or user ID or anything like that. So because OAuth was created to solve the API use case, it did not define anything about how to identify the user. It was always left out of scope. So if an application does need to know the user's name or a unique ID or their email or something, there is nothing in the OAuth spec that will tell you that. And that was a very intentional decision, an intentional line drawn in with OAuth. So that's what OpenID Connect does, right? OpenID Connect says, okay, if you do want to know about the user, whether that's just a unique ID or email or name or whatever, OpenID Connect defines mechanisms to obtain that information. So OpenID Connect is where the concept of an ID token is defined, and the fact that there even is a user ID in the first place. And so that's what it's solving. It's solving the user identity side of things and the authentication side of things.
Yeah, I think OpenID, if I can say so, OpenID is more of OAuth plus certain sections on how to securely access the user information from third-party application, like logging with Google or logging with Microsoft, all that.
Well, so OpenID Connect is that. OpenID has been around longer than OpenID Connect. And the original OpenID, like OpenID 1 and OpenID 2, were not built on OAuth. They were their own protocol that worked a totally different way, and it was only about identifying the user and did not provide a way to also grant access tokens. So one of the decisions that the OpenID community did was to rebuild OpenID on top of OAuth. So take the OAuth foundation, and then OpenID Connect is not a whole different way it works. It's just adding a couple of things. It's adding like an ID token as a concept, and maybe a new slight variation on how to obtain that in a flow that looks very similar to OAuth, but is slightly different over the wire. It defines scopes, for example. It defines the OpenID and the profile and the email scope, whereas OAuth does not define any scopes. OAuth says scope is a concept, and you have to define them for your API. But OpenID is defining the API, so it is defining the scopes for that API. It defines the user info endpoint, which is an API endpoint that the app can use to retrieve user information rather than it being inside of an ID token. And there's a bunch of just, details, variations around that theme. But yeah, that's what OpenID Connect is doing.
Yeah. So now OpenID Connect is being used by most of the identity providers as in secure and more of an interoperable way of sharing the user information between two different systems. SAML has been doing the same thing since 2005, and it's still equally popular. Do you see at any point where, hey, we don't need SAML, OADC can solve all the problems that SAML solves, if not better in certain situations?
Yeah, this is a fun one. So OpenID Connect absolutely can solve all the things SAML does. So like functionality wise, there's no need for SAML anymore. And one of the advantages of OpenID Connect is that because it's built on OAuth, it can give you two things at the same time. It can give you user identity claims like SAML, but it can also get you API access. SAML does not. SAML is only about user identity claims. Technical point of view, OpenID Connect is a complete replacement for SAML. Now, practically, the reason the SAML is still around is a whole different story. And it's because it's just there and it's been around longer and it's just baked into more things. And it's baked into technology stacks that are never going to change. It's also baked into people's heads as like, oh, this is enterprise security, right? And it's not, it's very challenging to break that assumption. And a lot of us are trying really hard because SAML is dead at this point. Like the working group for SAML shut down. There is no longer a place to do any changes to SAML. Even if people did try to update SAML, with new crypto signing methods or something, there's very little chance of it ever even getting implemented because the code that people run with SAML is so old and nobody knows how it works anymore, or it's on legacy systems that nobody even has the keys to deploy to anymore, but it's just kind of sitting there in your org somewhere, right? It's that kind of thing, but it's never going to go.
I'm also rooting for OAuth and OpenID to succeed, and because it has a lot of potential. Like I said, it is relevant even more so now than at a time when it was started, right? Now let's talk about the whole applicability of OAuth itself as a framework to authenticate an MCP server, because MCP server technically is like any other resource server, like your API server is another resource server. How that model fits really, really well in the context of MCP. I know you were part of the early conversations of when the authentication and authorization spec was being formed for MCP servers. What was that journey like? What was the initial conversations like? Is it pretty obvious that OAuth has to be the model for authenticating MCP servers?
So I wasn't actually around at the very beginning of it. I actually only got involved in the MCP world after the March update was published, which was the update that first introduced the concept of remote MCP servers. So I had not even heard of MCP before that. And that update came out. They made references to OAuth 2.1 and, using OAuth for this. And I was like, oh, this is really great. This is interesting. Let me take a look at this. And I found some, details of how we should clarify it and make it use OAuth better. And that was where I started getting involved, was let's try to push it in the direction of using the OAuth building blocks better, including things like the RFC, protected resource metadata RFC, which was just published around that same time, totally by coincidence. And that solves nicely the need for finding the authorization server given an MCP server. So yeah, is OAuth the only thing that makes sense for MCP? There's definitely some differing opinions on this, and it kind of depends on how you think the software that you're using, the MCP client software. And the reason that I still think OAuth is the right solution for this is that the MCP client is talking to resources, MCP servers that are not first party to that client. And it's very possible that some of those MCP servers are also just native servers. They're not even fronting an existing API. It's very possible that you can build, you have a existing API and you build an MCP server that just uses the API in the behind the scenes. And that's one pattern, but it's also possible to build an MCP server that just is that thing itself. Maybe it has direct database access or something. It's not in front of another API. And as soon as you have that kind of relationship, that's where OAuth very clearly fits this pattern of I'm granting some third-party application access to this this MCP server, this API, and we can leverage all the patterns that we already like with that. Versus alternatives could be, well, I don't think anybody's advocating for this, but one alternative path you could imagine is that the MCP software itself prompts you for credentials to the service it's trying to access, right? Where it's like, oh, we're trying to connect to this bank MCP server. Go enter your bank login into the MCP client. No one's going to do that, right? But it is another deployment option that is possible. And then the other one, which is more the actual one people are advocating for, is essentially treating the MCP client to server connection the same way that you would treat a browser to web server connection, where it's using effectively HTTP cookies. And there's different variations on what it actually could use in terms of how that could get deployed. But effectively, the idea is that, not specifying any, how those things are obtained or any formats or any requirements of what they represent, but it's just a link between the client software and the MCP server. And then if that needs a user to log in, it's handled the same way it would be in a web browser, where you use the web browser and you do stuff there to log in. It's another option. I do feel like the OAuth pattern fits better, and it maps more cleanly to this in all the different variations of how you might deploy it, versus being more limited in deployment options the other way.
I definitely agree with you. And also you spoke about this multiple patterns of building the MCP servers acting as wrappers of existing APIs. But I really hope that in the future, MCP servers actually act as parallel to API servers, where API servers are meant for developers who are reading the documentation. MCP servers are meant for kind of agentic clients that can automatically figure out how and when to talk to these MCP servers and how to get stuff done. And these act more like parallels than a wrapper over the other. Again, just for optimized performance of the MCP clients themselves.
Yeah, and I think that's the direction that the MCP community wants things to go as well. Is they like, not speaking for everybody, of course, but like what I'm seeing is that there is like a successful MCP ecosystem is that the services are exposed as MCP servers natively. Yeah. It's not just a wrapper around existing stuff, right?
Yeah. And because we're talking about APIs, there are a lot of APIs out there, right? Every company almost has their own API, and they already have built their own authentication mechanism for their APIs. Not all of them use OAuth as an authentication and authorization mechanism for their API servers. They use some sort of a PAT or API key or some sort of a mechanism, right? So now what does that world look like who already have a non-OAuth based authorization for their API servers? And now if they want to stand up an MCP server, they need to implement an OAuth authorization server. So how does that work? Like, is there a way that they can reuse their existing API key based auth mechanism to MCP servers?
So the redirect based OAuth pattern that MCP specifies in the docs is technically just one option. And there's other ways to make that to make that work as well. So at the end of the OAuth flow, the result is there's an access token, right?
Yeah.
And that's what's used in the requests. So how the access token is obtained, MCP does lay out, a sequence of steps for how to get the access token, but it's also possible to do it other ways. And this is also one of the concepts that the MCP spec is doing an update for in this next November update, is this concept of MCP auth extensions. And this is where there's specifically defined alternative methods to obtain access tokens by clients. One of them is when there's no user-involved client credentials, where it's the MCP server or MCP client is acting by itself for whatever reason, and there isn't actually a user in the flow. And the other one is the enterprise managed authorization, where you actually don't want the user to have to ever redirect or visit a browser or see a consent screen, because you want it all configured in your enterprise IDP policy. So effectively what that means is the MCP server's authorization server doesn't have to have any UI. It doesn't need to be able to interact with the user at all. It just needs to be able to issue tokens in response to API requests that it gets. So we have a couple of demos of that right now. So maybe in the show notes, we can link to those. But that's just an example of how, an alternative method for MCP clients to get access to the server. As far as your question, though, is about like, what if you already have an API key based approach? Ideally, you do want to keep your MCP server access scope to a user. Like, you don't want to have API keys that are over permissioned, over credentialed, and just like get access to everything. So if it is really a personal access token, right, like it's one user with their access token, what would be the fastest way to get MCP client support? I guess it would be, I don't think very many clients do this, but it's technically possible that a client could have an input field for access token, right?
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, like once the client goes through an OAuth flow, the result is the access token. Yeah. So I think some clients do this. I don't know how many or how widespread it is, but
VS
definitely
Code does it. Yeah, but not many MCP clients do it.
Yeah, that's the easy answer. I think there's probably other patterns we could explore about how to do that, but
yeah. So one thing that I hoped that you would recommend is asking people to move away from API key and use OAuth for their API authentication, because again, OAuth has been there for quite some time now. There is enough library support across programming languages that makes consumption and creation of the access tokens via the OAuth flow so much more easier. I think it's time API keys go away, and then it's like SAML, right?
I totally agree. There's a lot of problems with static API keys, and there's only so many things you can really do to fix those problems with API keys themselves. But moving to an OAuth flow, one of the primary benefits that you get is that the access tokens can be shorter lived, and you can do refresh tokens to get new access tokens. You could even use Depop and bind access tokens to client software so that the tokens aren't useful if they're stolen. So there's a lot of things you can leverage once you get into the OAuth ecosystem. Getting into the OAuth ecosystem, it's not no work, right? But there's a lot of SDKs, there's a lot of services that you can use to, you don't have to build an OAuth server. You can, plenty of options to choose from if you are trying to find an OAuth server, whether that's open source or commercial services or whatever, and use that to issue access tokens. And like we talked about right at the beginning of this, one of the initial design goals of OAuth was that, you have this flexibility of, if you are building an OAuth server, you don't have to follow the JOT access token spec because you can just handle things on your own. But if you are buying or spinning up an OAuth server separately, then now we have a spec for JOT access tokens that tells you all about exactly, the steps to take to validate them, and they're in a standard format, so there's better library support and all that. Right. The other part is, I do think there's actually some interesting, if you are in an enterprise company, then, and you're doing all this under an enterprise IDP, then this enterprise managed authorization extension, also called cross-app access, this is also a much easier way to get into the OAuth ecosystem compared to thinking of it as you're spinning up a whole OAuth server. Because really all you're doing is you're creating a authorization server that all it does is issue access tokens in response to a single request that comes from the client. So as long as you can follow the validation rules, that's actually not that big of a thing to even write from scratch, and plus it'll eventually show up in these, common OAuth server projects. Actually, just last weekend, I was working on a little prototype to try this out myself of, like, as an exercise, what would it take to build a tiny authorization server that is just a single file source code, and all it does is, takes in these requests for access tokens signed by an IDP, and then it issues an access token. And it is surprisingly little code. And that alone, like, I could deploy that somewhere and then no longer need API keys anywhere. And any user that has an account at the enterprise IDP would have access to this MCP server. And it's such a small amount of code to write. So hopefully I'll post that somewhere, once I clean it up a little bit. But it's a good demo. And I think that's a much better path, especially in the enterprise context, compared to API keys.
Yeah, I mean, two things I definitely want to see go away is passwords and API keys.
Yeah.
I think we have outlived the utility of these two concepts. I think it's high time we move away because we have better alternatives, we have safer alternatives, we have far more secure alternatives now.
Totally agree.
So, and moving on to the next topic, how do you see, again, like OAuth is predominantly built as an authorization mechanism, not necessarily an identity mechanism or an authentication mechanism. Now, with the advent of AI and AI agents, how do you see this whole OAuth framework evolving to meet the newer demands of the AI agents itself? Because they're ephemeral in nature, they need short-lived access. The access itself may need to keep changing based on the jobs that they're doing. How do you see the OAuth spec evolving in the context of AI workloads?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of conversations happening about this right now. I actually just came back from the IETF meeting in Montreal, where it's all the working groups in the IETF, meet and have their sessions, and there was a very large AI theme around almost every working group, including OAuth. And there's a lot in OAuth right now because there's a lot of extensions. There's a lot of stuff in the OAuth ecosystem right now that you actually can leverage for a lot of these things. Things like the challenge responses of managing different access, different scopes of access of tokens. There's another one is for if you're just talking about, like, you're building an API and then it's calling downstream services that are also your internal services. There's transaction tokens for that, which can be used to create downscoped tokens for individual API access internally. Outside of the OAuth world, there's a lot happening in the authorization space of how do you actually build an authorization model for these services. Some of that's happening in the OpenID Foundation and the AuthZen working group. So there's a lot of this stuff happening. I think there are definitely a few gaps. One of the questions that keeps coming up is, like, how do you represent this agent software? Like, what is its identity? Is it an OAuth client or is it something else? Is it more like a user or is it more like client software? Some of that is not super well defined, and there's varying opinions on it and varying opinions on how to model it in the rest of the ecosystem. So you'll see some of the new proposals are tackling that kind of thing. But largely, a lot of the stuff that's in the OAuth space you can put together in a way that you can use right now for some of this, and that is kind of what MCP is doing, right? MCP is saying, we're not going to build everything from scratch. We're not going to build the authorization layer from scratch. We're going to take OAuth, but we're going to pick certain parts of it that make sense.
Yeah.
And that's where they've chosen things like the protected resource metadata and now client ID metadata. And they've described the end-to-end, connect the dots for you. Because you're not going to connect the dots yourself if you just look at all the RFCs.
I think we need a software just to, once it is given a context, it will spit out all the relevant OAuth RFCs that you need to look at and go implement.
I've been thinking about doing that for a very long time, and it's because if you look at all the OAuth RFCs, they usually in the intro they try to describe the problem that they're solving or like the context in which you would use it. And I have not seen anybody put together this full list of like describe your problem and then show which RFCs are relevant to that problem. Maybe this is actually a good use for AI, right?
Yeah.
But I think it'd be really helpful because a lot of that's in my head and in other, of the community's head who spends all their time in these documents, but it's not obvious from the outside at all, right? But if you describe like, oh, I'm trying to do this, this, and this, I'll be like, oh yeah, you can use that for that RFC for that part. You can use this RFC for that part, and put together a functional ecosystem.
Yeah, I think I'll take that up as a weekend project.
Yeah.
So you spoke about two topics in the set of RFCs that actually can evolve and solve for AI workloads. One is transactional tokens, other is odds and. Can you dive deeper a little bit into the transactional tokens? Because I think it's pretty relevant in the context of MCP servers themselves. They need authentication, but they're also making internal calls to either other third-party applications or other internal APIs to get the work done for the MCP client.
Yeah. So transaction tokens, I do want to make sure this is very explicit. The scope for transaction tokens is calling internal services. So it's not meant to move across domains, and it's not meant to talk to third-party things. Right. So if you are building a MCP server and then you are also building internal microservices that are going to be called by the MCP server as part of how it does its job, that's what transaction tokens would be for. One example of that would be like you have an internal subsystem that's going to go and send an email receipt to a user. Right. So at some point you have an API internally that says like, here's an email address. Here's a email body. Go send the email, and it knows how to go and speak SMTP or whatever. Right. So what do you use for authentication to that? Well, most people today, the common pattern is API keys. You find your email provider, you go and get credentials to it, and the credentials basically the way that the credentials work is it'll send an email to anybody, right? Make a request with a valid credential and an email address, and it will send the email. It's definitely risky because you have a over-permissioned credential. It's an over-permissioned API key. Ideally, the credential that would be used to call that service would be downscoped and only able to send an email to the user who that token was issued in the context of. So this would be a use of transaction tokens where, the first OAuth access token is issued for a particular user. So we already know the user context. And now you don't want to just pass that access token to the email API and have it validated, because then it's getting a credential that can do other things also. So you actually want to downscope it and say, here's a transaction token that can send an email for the user whose token this is. And then the email service can validate that token and send the email, grab the email address out of the signed part of the token, not be presented with a credential that can just accept unsigned email address in the body. So that's an example of a use of transaction tokens. And that's where it's like, but it's all part of the internal processing of an API request.
Yeah. I still think it's a lot more valuable, especially when you're grouping together different microservices internally and then stand up an MCP server that can orchestrate things among these internal MCP servers to get a job done. And the MCP server can talk to these internal services by giving them a short-lived transaction token that is only valid for maybe one transaction, or that is maybe valid for 2 minutes or whatever. Do you want to also spend a little bit more time about OAuth? I've been following OAuth. It's been shaping up really well. I think they're gearing up for their spec revisions and publishing it formally. But then maybe you want to give a brief intro about Auth because I think it is really, really needed in the context of agentic applications and even more
Yeah.
powerful fine-grained access.
Yeah, well, so I will admit I haven't been spending that much time with Auth because I'm mostly focused on the outward facing stuff part of OAuth. But at a high level, it's how a system asks the question, is this user allowed to do X, right? And you can imagine if you're building an API, you already asked this question and solved this question somehow, right? And the way you've done it is it could be that you have code written that that just does these checks, right? Like when you get an API request to update a record in a database, at some point you've said, is this user allowed to update this record? And that could be because you look for a matching user ID column, or maybe it's more complicated and it's a relationship to some other table, right? And a lot of people just do this as, custom internal stuff. Various language frameworks might also provide tools for this kind of thing. I've seen this in a couple different frameworks where there will be a framework specific language or syntax for saying like, here's how to check if a user can access this particular record, and then you define hooks that whatever, right? So Auth is basically trying to standardize that pattern of like not only the pattern, but also then make it so that you can define all the policies in a totally separate system and then query that system. So centralize your authorization rules and logic, and then anything you're building can ask it questions about whether the user is allowed to access a particular thing or whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, this also makes your code more flexible and malleable because you're separating the authorization system, which can do extremely fine-grained authorization checks outside of your code base that can keep changing and evolving over a period of time as your code changes or as your product changes. So I think it's a brilliant spec. I hope it gets adopted as well as OAuth did. So Aaron, one last question. If there are engineers who really would love to understand OAuth much more deeper, or not just OAuth, right? Just about identity and authentication authorization space. What do you recommend that they go through, or what books do you recommend they read, or what RFCs would you recommend they read first? What is your recommendation for these engineers?
It's a big space. So I do keep the OAuth.net website up to date on in terms of like new RFCs. Although I think I need to do a pass on it. It's been a couple of months. But linking out to some of the new work that's going on, the experimental RFCs, there's a list of books on there that are good resources, one of which is mine. I tried to organize that book in terms of someone who's actually building an OAuth server and trying to learn the concepts of what goes into that. I also have a video course, and I do O'Reilly workshops a couple times a year about, again, like teaching OAuth and teaching these patterns. So those are also really good resources. There should be a couple other similar resources like that linked on OAuth.net as well. But yeah, it is a big space. I would say, I guess, generally, you are going to find that you have a preference for some part of the ecosystem over others. And for me, that's very much on the OAuth as the API interface layer versus the like internal microservices. Like that's not the part I focus on. And it's okay, right? Like it's a huge space. Everybody can't be an expert on everything. So if you are trying to figure out like, if you're feeling like you have to learn everything, like do a quick cursory skim of the whole space and then figure out what you're actually drawn to of like, are you finding yourself super, super interested in one aspect? And if so, like go deeper down that, right? And that might be your specialty because there is too much in this space for everyone to be on top of the whole thing all the time, especially once you get into the whole like identity side of it. When we get into the identity management side of it, there's just even more, different things to keep in mind and to dive into there. So yeah, I guess totally fine to find this focus that you're particularly interested in and just deep dive on that.
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant advice. I mean, you may get overwhelmed by the number of topics that are available for you to browse through, and rather than just doing that, just stick to what appeals to you more and then go deeper into that particular subject. Thank you so much, Aaron. This has been really helpful, and thank you so much for telling us all about OAuth and your experiences, and also what is upcoming, and then how people can leverage OAuth better for securing their API servers and MCP servers, and how it can be used in the agentic workloads.
Yep. Thanks.
Thanks.